All right, gamers. Okay, we're doing something a little bit different this time. Um, we've now beaten Sekiro as completely as I'm willing to. We achieved every ending without save scumming, so 4 different playthroughs. We achieved every achievement. Didn't bother with the reflections of strength or the gauntlets of strength, but because they were added after launch as like DLC, I'm less inclined to deal with them. I don't think I'm going back and doing that. This video is supposed to be like a post-game debrief, part critique, part review, maybe some retrospective in there, reflections on my time playing it. And this is not the video that I intended to make, because since completing Sekiro, I've then put another like 12 hours into, well, certainly organizing my thoughts for this video in like script format, and then another 8 hours or so of playing Sekiro, Dark Souls 1, and Dark Souls 3 for B-roll that is just way too much effort, and on top of like trying to teach myself DaVinci Resolve, like that's not happening. So we're going to do something a little bit simpler. But I want to talk about Sekiro and the experience I had and my thoughts on it. So to start, I think I want to talk a little bit about how I view Sekiro as like a piece of media. Like, what is it? Give us a grounded point to discuss it from. So for me, Sekiro is FromSoft's action-adventure follow-up to 2016's Dark Souls 3. The two games did have some overlapping development, but there was like a 2-year-ish gap from Dark Souls releasing to Sekiro coming out. It shares a lot of DNA with all of the Soulsborne games that came before it, but it also differs in a lot of key ways, and it paved new ground both for the genre and for FromSoft. So like stuff that's returning from other Souls games. You've got the trademark challenging technical combat with narrow thresholds for failure. Nearly every enemy in Sekiro demands respect in a straight-up fight. Bosses still require careful study and planning to learn their movesets, develop strategies. You've still got checkpoints, now called Sculptor's Idols. They heal the player, they refresh enemies, they allow for fast travel. All very familiar. Asymmetrical multiplayer still remains, though in a diminished capacity. Players can leave ghostly, like, platforming instructionals to guide other players, but it felt way more like trolly and useless than genuinely helpful. Most of the ones I clicked on were like just somebody standing in place and like wiggling their sword or whatever. Like none of them were actually showing me pathing through an area. I turned them off almost immediately. Gone are the bloodstains telling you how and where other players died. Gone are the soapstone messages telling you to finger butthole. Because Sekiro kind of like eschews all cooperative or PvP multiplayer. There's no summoning friends to help with bosses. There's no repelling invaders. Gone are all the RPG elements of character class selection, leveling up, equipping gear. You no longer have grip changes or heavy attacks or dodge rolling. Running and dodging got a rework. And then Sekiro comes packed with all of these fresh new ideas for players to discover and experiment with, right? Like, Sekiro has a real narrative. Characters aren't as cryptic. They got important stuff to say. They have tasks for you to go do. A key feature in Sekiro that's new is the resurrection system. Players can revive on death under certain conditions and continue the fight. It's loaded with new equipables. Instead of just armor and weapons, you got shinobi tools. You got ninjutsu techniques to give you like a perk for performing backstabs. You got combat arts that now aren't tied to a specific weapon like in previous Souls titles, which is a feature we'd see return, at least in some capacity, in Elden Ring. Outside of combat, players get all sorts of new movement and traversal options, from ledge climbing, hanging, wall hugging, sneaking, jumping, and grapple hooking. Enemies get some new tricks, right, with the perilous attacks, which are special attacks denoted with a glyph that can't be blocked or deflected like normal. And Sekiro gets a fucking pause button, which is like revolutionary in FromSoft games. Amazing. You can pause. Thematically, Sekiro ditches the fantasy and like gothic or eldritch horror from previous Soulsborne titles, and replaces that with a game that's set in this like mystical feudal Japan. Fantastical elements still remain, but the enemies and the bosses are like significantly more grounded, both in design and in physical scale than previous Soulsborne games. You still have like some enemies that are rendered larger, but much of the time the enemies you're fighting are like people your size. And while, I had intended this look back on Sekiro to like focus on the stuff that I didn't really jive with and that rubbed me the wrong way, I did want to start sort of in my reflections on it with going through a bunch of the stuff that I really did like, because I didn't have a terrible time. I did rage at it a little bit, but I had fun. It wasn't an A++, but fun was had. So like, I really appreciated FromSoft experimenting with mobility and how that informed level design, even if stuff like Ashina Castle's floor plan didn't make any fucking sense. How was anybody, except for Wolf, supposed to make it up to the top levels? Like, where were the staircases? I didn't see any. Like, were they supposed to climb that center atrium? I don't know. Okay, yeah, FromSoft still used, a mystical world centered around, like, a medieval castle past its prime that's, like, dilapidated. That's kind of like FromSoft's one move. But, the change in setting from European dark fantasy to feudal Japan was a welcome one. The soundtrack was top to bottom bangers. I really enjoyed finding and upgrading the different shinobi tools. I was getting like some strong Metroidvania vibes early on with that initial exploration, collecting new tools, and that let me like challenge new enemies in fun ways. You get the axe, and then you can break the axe dudes or the shield dudes. Sweet, really cool. They didn't do as much with that as I thought they were going to. They certainly didn't limit progress in areas based on what tools you had, but it definitely felt more Metroidvania, like explicitly, than just an homage to Metroidvania games, like some of the older Souls games did. I really enjoyed the narrative. I appreciated that there was like a little more overt storytelling than say a Dark Souls game. You know, it didn't feel heavy-handed. You know, maybe there was a little more exposition and dialogue in certain parts, but like it wasn't oppressive. And you know, that exposition added to the storytelling from the world building that they do so well. I enjoyed many of the bosses, at least the first time I fought them, you know, especially the unique story bosses like Genichiro, Owl, Guardian Ape, Demon of Hatred, the Emma Ishin fight from the Shota ending, all really good. Coming from Night Rain especially, I really appreciated the speed and the pace of the game. Surge sprinting is really tough to give up, having now gone back to Dark Souls 1 and 3 recently. I miss surge sprinting. But the scale is completely different and it makes less sense in those games. Even if some of the elements of Sekiro weren't like pitch perfect, you know, weren't like my ideal expression of the genre, I still had a pretty good time with Sekiro. At least, you know, lots of parts of it. I did struggle, however, for a long time with the purpose of Shadows Die Twice. Like, who was this game for? You know, I've largely enjoyed the other FromSoft Souls titles, even if I was a little late to the party. You know, I didn't get in there super early. Fell in love with Dark Souls 1. Got to play Demon's Souls on PS3 right before they shut the servers down. Had like my first playthrough of Elden Ring and Shadow of the Erd Tree was like 300 hours, and then another almost 200 into Night Rain, 180 maybe. Like, it was a lot of time. You know, granted, I'm not replaying these games a ton, but you know, I've loved all the FromSoft games that I've played. Sekiro felt a little different, and I think I've decided why it irked me. And that's that Sekiro wasn't made for me. Part of me thinks that Sekiro was built for like a player much newer to From Software's masochistic formula, right? It's a slightly easier on-ramp with some of those sharp esoteric edges sanded smooth. The DNA is clearly there, but if Elden Ring Shadow of the Erd Tree, at least according to Miyazaki, is From Software pushing the envelope in terms of what players can handle, From Software, their efforts in Sekiro feel like a softer, more forgiving iteration on that formula. It's less demanding of the player, it's less needy, it's more streamlined, and at the same time, it's like a game built for the Soulsborne perfectionist, right? The player who wants to break the game over their knee and really showcase what you can do with that combat system. Like, for them, the player who gets, you know, so adept at dispatching bosses that it looks effortless. Sekiro is this, like, ballet of clashing swords and posture-broken death blows. I'm neither of those players, right? So Sekiro felt like too generous from the outset, but then also tuned for the player I'll never become, which is somebody riding that, like, knife's edge in combat that can look so cinematic. The game in the middle ground between those two wasn't one I was particularly hyped to play. I had some fun with it, sure, but it wasn't the type of game I was hoping for, and we definitely had some real differences of opinion along the way. So, like, first off, with Sekiro ditching multiplayer, From Software decided that they could offer something that no other Souls game had before, or since, honestly, which is a pause feature. Lots of games have pause features. What's wrong with a pause feature? What could possibly be wrong with a pause feature? Okay. So, with pausing, it had all of these knock-on effects, and I think some real trade-offs. For a Souls game, being able to pause means there's no opportunity cost for opening your menu. You can't be attacked while you fiddle with settings. Being able to pause at any time and swap out shinobi tools, combat arts, ninjutsu, or any of your equipped consumable items means that essentially you have them all equipped all of the time. There's no interesting decision-making opportunities around like how you choose a loadout or what you bring into battle, because you can change whenever and there's no penalty for doing so. If before like a critical boss fight encounter you had to plan out your kit, like, well, I know I'm going to want to bring in a loaded umbrella, and I know I'm going to want to bring in a firecracker. Do I bring in like a flame vent just because maybe it's a red eye? Or do I bring in the loaded axe, to have some extra stagger? Or maybe I like hedge my bets a little bit and have something that's a little longer range, so I go with like a shuriken or a kunai. No, it doesn't matter. You have all of them equipped on you all the time. You don't have to choose. Swap at a moment's notice. This lets you iterate on strategies much faster because you can, in one boss attempt run through, basically all of your shinobi tools, run through all of your combat arts, just like boom, 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 test them, see which ones are effective, which ones aren't. Imagine if you had to lock in a selection of items at the Sculptor's Idol, right? Or at least like risk getting attacked while swapping them out mid-battle. Those choices then have weight, because changing your mind has consequences. You got to try again, or you got to try and open up the menu mid-fight. Instead, it felt like this was a decision to like remove friction for new players. Even back in the day, just having a lot of different items, like the consumable items, equipped at once could be a pain in the ass, because like you're flipping through them sequentially, and maybe you find the right one, or maybe you accidentally go over and then you got to recycle back through. And opening up your menu mid-boss fight to swap items out or change weapons out can be really fraught and nerve-wracking, right? Pausing, to me, felt cheesy. I didn't like it at all. Further reducing player decision-making was the choice to avoid character builds, ditching all of the RPG elements, right? You still unlock skills from the skill tree, but there's only a couple of useful ones, right? It's not chock full of super impactful decisions. You got Mikiri counter, which is super important. You get that really early on. A lot of people have success with Mortal Draw, because apparently it can like stagger bosses pretty easily, interrupt attacks, but apart from that, there's not like a ton of great skills in there. I understand this decision on From Software's part, right? The RPG elements of the Souls games are like, they're clunky, they're obtuse, they're intimidating. It's a lot of numbers. But part of those systems was this assumption that like every player couldn't do everything, right? If you want to be able to do the most melee damage by two-handing or dual wielding, you might not be able to block super well. You can give up some of that offensive power to sword and board. But then you have other interesting decisions to make, like, do you prioritize blocking as much physical damage as possible? Are you trying to block certain elemental damage? Are you equipping a smaller, like, buckler shield to be able to parry attacks? With Sekiro, it's like everything everywhere all at once, right? And the developers even talked about this, where they wanted to make a game where players wouldn't feel restricted from large parts of the combat options because of build decisions they had made. They could make a game where everyone gets the same kit and you balance around that kit, and then everybody can make use of every tool. You're not making trade-offs to do the cool stuff, right? It's a double-edged sword. If everybody can do everything, you don't have to make a trade-off to do that cool thing. You want perfect blocks? Okay, you get perfect blocks. Deflecting attacks in Sekiro? 100%. You can't even be posture broken if you keep doing them right. It's insane. The perilous attack counters? You don't even need to equip it. You can just Makiri counter whenever you want. Okay, you need to block something specific? Well, just pause the game. Throw on the right umbrella. You're like an unstoppable, waddling, like, Abrams tank. If every player has the correct answer available all of the time, there's less room for player expression in how they choose to prioritize from a pool of, like, competing exclusive options. You can still choose which tools you use, but because you don't have to choose the tools which you have available, I find that to be like an infinitely less interesting choice because there aren't the same consequences. And I can't be the only one to feel this way, because right after this, they went back to the original Souls formula with Elden Ring. Yeah, it feels like there are less interesting choices when you get to do everything, even if the game is like, even if they balanced around that specifically. Also, as a gift to new players, backstabs. You can backstab all of the things now. Virtually every enemy in the game is backstabbable. Many mini bosses are backstabbable, at least for, like, the first death blow. And while we, like, will lament video games that have discrete stealth sections, having the whole thing be stealthable without an opportunity cost there also isn't super riveting. It meant that the interstitial level sections between boss fights were some of the least threatening, frankly the shortest, of any FromSoft game I've played. Vanishingly few level sections posed any real impediment to progress, right? And then backstabbing made them even easier. Why learn combat if there's a mechanic for sidestepping combat entirely? You can just backstab all the enemies and get right to the boss. If you weren't going to run past all the enemies to begin with, which, because the levels are so short, it's super easy to do. Similarly simplified was the managing of the risk of death. So no longer do you, like, die carrying souls and you'll lose a ton of progress unless you can manage to retrace your steps back to where you died and collect them again. It's the classic corpse run, right? In Sekiro, if you die, you just lose half. You just lose half. Except for the special times where you don't. Now, if you have earned enough XP to get a full skill point, you get to lock in those gains and you can't lose points anymore. There's no redemptive counterplay if you fuck up. Miyazaki was talking about this in interviews around the game launch, where they really wanted to experiment with different systems and not do the same thing just like over and over again, specifically talking about bloodstains and recollecting your souls. And I respect the instinct to not just like rest on your laurels and keep doing the same thing, get experimental, try new stuff. Sure. But the thing they replaced that system with, the bloodstains, is less good. It's worse. It's less engaging. Maybe it's better for new players as one less thing they have to worry about, one fewer system to learn. But just like with the RPG elements, they went back to that bloodstain system with Elden Ring. I'm down for trying alternatives. Just getting rid of the system with something simple and dumb was not it. Not as good. And at this point, I'm like starting to think, is Sekiro just like Dark Souls for normies? You got the simplified decision making. You've got, revives that reduce boss runs and repeated boss attempts. Like, is it simplified and streamlined for the new player? As I played more, I noticed a bunch of other annoyances, new and old. From Software's camera lock-on feature has always been like dog water. But it was for like a predictable reason. You've got enormous towering enemies. They would force the camera into this like unacceptably steep angle, and the lock-on would break. Sekiro has small enemies and small bosses. But because the levels are so tight and claustrophobic, the camera gets easily jammed up against walls and objects. Fast-moving enemies confuse the camera in these tight spaces, and the lock-on breaks when you need it the most. This claustrophobia, it presented other problems also. Like, sure, From Software's camera never likes getting smushed up against a wall. It like tightens up on the player character like really close, and it makes assessing the game state really difficult. Dark Souls never really cared if you fully obscured your camera, though. You could like have objects and walls and shit in the way, and it'd be fine. It just let you not see anything. From Software attempted to rectify this and keep the game legible by making terrain and objects in Sekiro, like the ones behind the player character, super opaque, so you can still see the action. Not immediately, like the thing would cover up your view and then turn opaque. In practice, though, it's so easy to like back up into a wall or object, and then because you're focused on the enemy looking for movement that they're going to like come in for an attack, something telegraphing a move, you don't see the object coming in frame and then becoming opaque. So you don't know that you've backed up into a wall or an object until the camera starts to pull in really close, because the object is effectively invisible for you. The player just sees Wolf like not responding like they'd expect him to, and getting caught against some invisible level geometry, which is super triggering. The backstab system was another pain point. From Software's backstab is like, it's been quirky for years, and the engines are all sort of similar, so those quirks remained game to game. But as a like a guide for new players in Sekiro, they added this like red glyph that appears on enemies when they're backstabbable. Except no, it doesn't. Sometimes it doesn't appear, yet the enemies still get backstabbed. Or it'll appear, but then pressing the attack button doesn't trigger the backstab animation. You just inexplicably swing a regular attack at an enemy you never intended to fight. Like, surely this was designed as a player aid for new players to get used to the backstab system, to let them know it was there, and then to give them a clue as to when they were close enough to trigger it. But so often it would send mixed signals and junk data that I felt like the game was betraying me. The grapple hook felt like similarly, it was like an idea that was undercut by, really inconsistent behavior. Now, the promise of vertical traversal and exploration, like, opened up all of these, like, level design opportunities that we hadn't seen in Dark Souls before. But the thing wouldn't work right. The grapple hook sucked shit. When we're talking about the grappling hook, I should briefly explain how it works so we can understand where my frustrations lie. Essentially, the grappling points have 4 states. They have unmarked, too far away, accessible, and inaccessible. So unmarked is just like how it sounds. You just see the level geometry. There's no glyph indicating a grapple point. Too far away is where you see a gray glyph indicating a grapple location, but you are not close enough to interact with it. Accessible is your green grapple point glyph. Grapple point's good to go. And then inaccessible is a crossed out green glyph that means you're close enough, but there's something else wrong and it's not going to let you grapple from there. Grapple points are only usable if you get that green accessible glyph present. It indicates the player is close enough, given their current health, because apparently low health reduces your grapple point range. And then also that the grapple point is valid from your location. And that last bit is really the crucial part. Because in Sekiro, your angle of approach is really important for a lot of grapple points. Lots of them have these like weird dead zones where if you're in just the right spot, the grapple point doesn't appear as accessible. In fact, most of the time when that happens, if you hit that dead zone, the grapple point just disappears entirely as unmarked. The player's within range, the grapple point just like fails to appear. In some instances, you'll have multiple grapple points close by, and the game, it only shows you one grapple point at a time. It'll prioritize the grapple point that is physically closer to Wolf, but completely off screen compared to the grapple point that's like center screen, you're moving towards it, and was just recently visible as a gray too far away state. It'll be gray too far away and then disappear, and another grapple point that you can't even see off screen turns green. Like, I can't remember how many times I'd like see a grapple point, jump towards it, see it gray, and then it disappear as I'm like mashing the grapple button, and then no other grapple points appear for me to grapple onto, and I just fall to my death. Like, what the fuck is that? My hypothesis here is that for a lot of level sections, the grapple points have these like sweet spots designed for an intended level pathing. Stray from that pathing, come in at like an odd angle, and it just doesn't work right. Nowhere was that more frustrating than the fight against the Divine Dragon. You got the grapple points that will appear in that fight on the trees as accessible from like way off screen, like super far away from the player. But if you stand directly in front of that tree, such that it like dominates your view, takes up most of the screen, and it doesn't even show up as a grapple point. Like, you gotta back way the fuck up before it even appears as accessible. But grappling to the ones like the adjacent trees way far off, super easy to do. Maybe that is like more forgiving for newer, sloppier players, but the inconsistency of that grapple point system, particularly in that fight, but just in general, was rage-inducing. Like, it felt super capricious, and the more I felt like I understood how it worked, like how that system functioned, it would surprise me and disappoint me yet again in some new, exciting way. Like, the grapple points they would be gray, and then you jump at them and fall past them and never turn green, or just disappear completely. Or they'd be like inaccessible until you approach them from just the right angle, because no creative like pathfinding. You got to use the tools exactly the way they wanted you to. No, thank you. Yuck. There were other camera oddities too. I found this weird thing where backing up against walls in boss fights, where the camera was too smushed and Wolf wasn't sufficiently in frame, the game wouldn't accept certain inputs like blocks, deflects, or shinobi tools. I found a ledge where the camera could remove Wolf from the frame just enough that the game stopped accepting directional inputs on that ledge, and you couldn't slide left or right. He needed to be like more on the screen to move around. The game like literally missed inputs based on the camera position if Wolf wasn't in frame sufficiently. The same thing sort of happened with chests too. The game was really picky about how you interacted with chests. You could open a chest, but then if the camera was like slightly askew and you weren't looking dead on at the front of the chest, you couldn't loot the item inside. You had to like readjust the camera like more straight on as opposed to like perpendicular to the front. Same with the sculptor's idols, actually. They couldn't be interacted with if you were like, if they were slightly out of frame. Like, you could see them, Wolf is pointing at it, and you have the interact button on screen, but because not enough of the sculptor's idol is visible on screen, you couldn't interact with it. I don't recall other FromSoft games having that kind of interaction. I went back and did a little bit of testing and didn't notice anything anywhere as egregious as what I found in Sekiro. So I think they made some major adjustments to the engine there with like how interacting with stuff works based on the camera. And it was unwelcome. Now I want to like switch gears a little bit because we haven't really talked about combat, and combat is, you could argue, like the focal point of any of these games. The whole thesis of the genre, right, is that every enemy is deadly, every enemy can dispatch you easily, like bosses require thoughtful consideration, to determine where the player is safe from attacks, how to find openings, when to deal damage. I've always thought about the FromSoft games, or the Soulsborne series specifically, as like combat puzzles, right? Where you have to work out solutions to these boss puzzles, or even level puzzles. And then that's married with these like this very narrow threshold for failure. Sekiro felt similar, but the idea was a little more formalized. So enemies have a variety of different attack types. They've got ranged attacks, melee attacks, jumping attacks, elemental attacks, and a variety of these perilous attacks, right? Sweeps, grabs, thrusts, chops. Each kind of attack has a predetermined counter. So if you know the type of attack the enemy is planning, if you know what they're coming in with, you can press the corresponding button and have the appropriate response. And I think this is like one of the core reasons that Sekiro didn't work for me. This like flattened combat decision making. It means that, sort of reductively, the game felt a little too much like Bop It. Like, look at any forum or guide for new players, and they basically all give the same advice for getting used to the combat in this game. Don't move. Just stand still. Just learn to press the correct button for each incoming attack. Sword swing, deflect it. Perilous swipe, you jump it. Thrusting, you got a thrusting attack, you Makiri it. Perilous chop, you sidestep it. Bop it, flick it, pull it, twist it. Ugh. Maybe it's more like, what's the game, like Dance Dance Revolution, which to me feels like the final boss in reducing video games to, press the right buttons in the correct predetermined order to win. But because the combat was like so formalized in that way, every attack has like a predetermined correct response, it felt like the player needed less experimentation to figure out how to survive fights. The boss would just like kind of tell you what they were going to do, and you just had to remember to press the right button at that time to survive. Yeah. And from very early on, like, I chose a different path. I played a little differently. For all of the frustration that it added, this was like why I opted to mostly avoid blocks and deflections for my playthrough. As dumb or as maddening as that might have seemed. And I've always kind of played Souls games like that. I'll experiment with all the tools. I'll try out magic, I'll try out summoning. I'll give it all a shot. And then I'll try and manage encounters with like as few of those tools as possible. Or with some tools but not others. Like try and do this fight just with magic, or this fight, no magic, no buffs, no items, that kind of thing. I can't think of anything less fun than standing in place in one of these boss rooms and just pressing the right buttons in response to beat the boss. Perfect blocks and deflections without any opportunity cost, to me, felt like cheap. I wanted to have a little more agency, and trying to beat the game as much as was feasible without some of those tools made me feel like I regained a little bit of that agency. I know it's not the game they designed, so I can't fault Sekiro exactly for the nonsense that I put myself through. Um, but the intended cadence of fighting and clashing swords and building posture bars was not a game I wanted to play at all. You know, I've never been a guy to use buffs in Soulsborne games. I'm not stacking items and spells and weapon arts and shit to like boost my damage and clown on a boss. I'm in there trying to learn how to keep myself safe, whittle them down bit by bit, take it real slow. Even with builds that generally don't output a lot of damage. With Sekiro, the idea of like getting good enough to have that perfect run where I keep the pressure on and stagger a boss with like a nearly full health bar and get a really fast death blow is the opposite of the game I would ever want to play. So, like, for better or worse, I try to do something else. There were a couple of bosses where I definitely had to break my rule. Long Arm Centipede was kind of designed around deflections, and so I made an exception there. The Owl Father boss at Hirata Estate had some combos that, like, they required deflecting since he has a really fast approach and a really long melee range that would just punish you if you tried to back up when you noticed him telegraphing that. Otherwise, I just tried to stick to, like, just dodging as best I could. Dodging and running away. There were other, small combat annoyances and bugs. Sometimes the perilous attack glyph just wouldn't appear with a move that was clearly perilous. Like, I'd learned that fight enough to know which ones were perilous, and the glyph just wouldn't show up. The combat arts themselves felt pretty underwhelming. They didn't do nearly as much damage as regular attacks. Almost as if, like, the damage wasn't scaling with my attack upgrades. I couldn't figure that one out, but they were very underwhelming. Some of them maybe did some decent posture damage, but the way I was playing, that wasn't especially useful to me. Jump attacks also sucked. They did almost no damage. I couldn't find a use for jump attacks. Maybe creating a small opening, like hitting them to like get a mini stagger. But jump attacks were useless. Some of the shinobi tools were okay for dealing with like regular enemies who weren't a threat to begin with, but man, they barely touched bosses. Since beating Sekiro, I've since seen folks cheese out bosses with specific tools or like stun lock them into oblivion, but that wouldn't have been interesting to me anyway. Like, I never would have done that. I'm not trying to beat bosses that way generally. The umbrella did feel pretty busted, but a bunch of the tools, they just had such low damage, both vitality and posture, that like I'd rarely use them for bosses. And maybe this is for the newer player, right? Who would want to rely on those tools to like get you through a difficult section of level, or to cheese out a boss. But the tools and the arts, for me, were not helpful. And with few exceptions, I found them to be like a profound waste of time. The enemies in Sekiro didn't help combat either. As far as like Souls games go, I found Sekiro to have a profound lack of enemy diversity. For a game that had no problem leaning into some of the more mystical and fantastical elements for the story pieces, the enemies stayed pretty firmly like in that feudal Japan setting. The day-to-day enemies were like much more grounded and human scale. um, the enemy diversity amounted to like different men with swords and then like other similar men with guns and spears, right? The mini bosses got reused repeatedly. That made sense in a game as big as Elden Ring, and it made a lot less sense in a game as compact as Sekiro. In a single playthrough of Sekiro, you could ostensibly fight. Where is it? You could fight 2 chained ogres, 2 bulls, 2 long arms, 2 snake eyes, 2 Ashina elite, 2 spear samurai, 3 sword samurai, 3 drunkards, 3 Shichiman warriors, 3 lone shadows, and fucking 4 headless. Is too much. Is too much repeated bosses. Previous From Software games would do this trick where like an early boss would become a regular enemy later on when you're more powerful. It's kind of fun, you know, shows growth. Sekiro didn't even bother with this idea. Most of the enemies in the game are like basic, easily avoided, easily dispatched, certainly trivialized with backstabs. The mini bosses are super repetitive, and the various versions of them, where you fight the same one in a couple of different locales, like, it's really just changing scenery. They don't change in meaningful ways. My biggest disappointment, though, with the enemies in Sekiro is more thematic. A main feature of the FromSoft Souls games is like the punishing enemies, right? Bosses are these serious efforts that don't die easily, you know, until like you master that encounter. You know, you've fought it over and over again and really are dialed in. But previous FromSoft games paired that gameplay with these themes of like high fantasy and gothic horror, cosmic horror, right? The Souls games are like chock-a-block with monsters and dragons and horrors and beasts. You'd fight dudes, sure. You'd fight like men in armor. But even those were often like hulking and inhuman, towering knights that like dwarf the player, and that physicality communicates their strength and durability in those fights. That these like otherworldly enemies require repeated bludgeoning when the player themselves die in a few quick hits is like thematically resonant, right? We're fighting unspeakable horrors. No shit, you can't backstab them in one hit. Of course. But in Sekiro, the dissonance there is like deafening, right? It's a lot harder to suspend one's disbelief when the enemies we're hitting dozens of times are just like flesh and blood people. Same size as our character. They're not mystical or magical in any like narrative sense, right? This regular human boss that you're fighting just has a really big health bar because bosses require a really big health bar. Yeah, okay, the regular enemies, you can death blow them in one hit. And that's fitting, sure. But if you try and fight those same enemies straight up, you could be sinking like 10 or 20 sword attacks into a normal dude with a wife and kids who will cut you down in like 3 or 4 hits. I appreciate studios like trying out new settings and getting experimental, but this to me felt like one of those ludonarrative dissonance things where like the things the gameplay is asking you to do don't match, or at least insufficiently match, the story they're trying to tell. Like, this game already has, you know, ghosts and gods and monsters, but the game then barely leans into that stuff. The ghostly enemies like the yokai, the headless and Shichiman warrior, they almost feel like afterthoughts, where like they needed to pad out the game with extra bosses, right? None of those bosses none of them are required. Even Orin of the Water is optional. None of them have story implications. They're all just like extra filler. Now, my complaint here kind of falters a little bit if you are playing the game as intended, with, you know, posture breaking bosses and death blowing them. You're clashing swords, you're deflecting, you're building up that posture bar, you're striking them down in one hit from full health. But it didn't have to, right? Genichiro is a great example of this, where he's got, I don't know, some like cursed seal shit, you know, going on, where it helps explain like his inhuman durability and the fancy lightning. Like he's got some other, you know, mystical properties. But for a boss like Emma, who is, as far as I can tell, just a well-trained human person with a sword, if you're not posture breaking her, she needs like 30 hits to die to get that death blow, but she hits me 3 times and I'm dead. That doesn't make any fucking sense. I hate that. Just make them monsters. If it's a monster, I can ignore that I'm, you know, sinking 20 minutes into beating this boss. But if it's just like another person, that narrative dissonance drives me nuts. Now, when it comes to dog water enemies, let's briefly talk about what a huge disappointment the Divine Dragon fight was. This is like, the Divine Dragon fight is the climactic action sequence of the whole game. The whole game, the entire narrative is driving towards this one encounter, right? It's the lamest puzzle boss since fucking Bed of Chaos. They traded all of the potential for a challenging and meaningful encounter for this like splashy, cinematic, mindless one. And it wasn't even fun. It made me angry that that is how they chose to like crescendo their narrative, right? This weak, limp-ass double boss fight that sucks shit from start to finish. I honestly would have been less disappointed if the whole thing was a cutscene. A game with bosses that are cinematic for cinematic's sake is why I avoid most AAA games to begin with. They pull their punches, right? And they make the player feel like a superhero. And I don't have time for that shit, right? Throw me into the meat grinder. If I want to watch somebody else do cool shit, I'll watch TV. Add to that fight the grapple point issue with the trees, and the Divine Dragon was a fucking disaster. Like an unmitigated disaster. Like the kind you would send in FEMA for. I hated the whole thing so much. Ugh. Now, I did have other complaints, smaller complaints with Sekiro. They were mostly, you know, annoyances. design decisions that I didn't agree with. For instance, the action button had too many functions associated with it. You had talk, drop or climb ledges, hug walls, pick up items, like items in the world, and then you could hold it to manually collect item drops. It meant that since you had to collect those drops, like the drop money, manually, which in and of itself I thought added absolutely zero to the game, you'd often accidentally hug a wall or drop off of a ledge nearby, since they also made a change where actions happen on button press rather than button release. So you always trigger the action button even if you just want to hold it. And this, to me, was like the designers just overcomplicating things when so many of the choices they made seem to revolve around like simplifying things for players, taking out unnecessary systems. Sort of related to that, they did a rework in Sekiro of running and dodging that drove me to the edge of my sanity, especially considering how I decided to play the game. So, dodging in Sekiro is more of a quick step, which in and of itself is like, fine. That's fine. I don't need dodge rolling. But because they also made that change where you dodge on button press, not on release, every time you go to run, you have to quick step first. What broke me, though, was how this interacted with running. When you're running, if you change direction too abruptly, you drop out of your run state. And you need to quick step again just to get back up to speed. In practice, this had me like running in sweeping circles, so I didn't cut like too hard of an angle to drop out of my run. Like, you wouldn't want to cut too hard and then stop you dead in your tracks and be left vulnerable to an enemy coming in. Don't want to get punished just because you like ran the wrong direction. And then even worse was if enemies moved too fast relative to the player, and there were a couple of examples that were really egregious, boss fights specifically. If the enemy moved too fast while you were locked on, the camera would like whip around in a way where you'd accidentally change your run angle too aggressively and drop out of the run state, and then leave you vulnerable to that enemy that is just closed distance on you. Maybe this, like, it's not how they intended Sekiro to be played, but it annoyed me nonetheless. What was intentional, though, was the way dodges worked with ledges. Now, Sekiro has plenty of ledges where you're never allowed to walk off. You have to jump off. Especially the trees that you can, like, grapple to. Can't walk off those, you have to jump off. It has plenty of ledges you can walk off. You can direct Wolf to walk off any of those ledges from any camera position. But if you are locked onto an enemy, you cannot quick step off that same ledge unless you are facing the ledge. If you try to, you get caught on the ledge, and it prevents you from quick stepping off of it. You can back up from an enemy and try to dash away with a quick step, only to be stopped by a ledge that you could have turned around and walked off of backwards. But you can't quick step off of backwards. Now, Dark Souls let you dodge roll off of any ledge in any direction, consequences be damned. This feels to me like one of those changes From Software made to like keep new players from doing dumb shit. And it just had unintended consequences for me personally. I hated this. Why can I quick step off of a ledge when I'm facing it, but from no other direction? If I had an aneurysm ready to burst while playing this game, this quick step shit would have ended my life. Like, discovering this quirk made me as mad as I have ever been. Fuck, I'm mad thinking about it right now. Oh, God, I hate it. All of this is sort of to say that, like, Sekiro and I had a troubled relationship. The rough edges, you know, and obtuse, quirky gameplay of the Souls games was kind of gone. They smoothed that stuff out. And, you know, maybe the writing was on the wall after Dark Souls 3 that, like, these high fantasy games for weirdos that they were making were, like, kind of getting too popular and breaking containment, and they needed something, you know, a little more palatable for the normies. You know, something less niche, less cryptic, more accessible. Not easy exactly. Sekiro isn't easy, but more streamlined. Less clunky and cumbersome. You know, to me, that's Sekiro, right? It's a fantastic entry point to the genre, to the Souls games themselves. It's, you know, the ultra palatable amuse-bouche before you dive into, like, the grim, dark, and brutal stuff. But for somebody who fell in love with those older Souls games exactly because of what they were, Sekiro felt like the gateway drug that I no longer required and didn't particularly crave. Far be it from me to, you know, condemn studios for trying new stuff and playing to different audiences. I think they did that very well. I'm glad Sekiro exists, and it's not a bad game by any means. It just wasn't for me. It wasn't for me. Except for Demon of Hatred. I really like Demon Hatred. Okay. That's it. That's all for me. I hope this better elucidates my thinking on Sekiro and some of the issues I had with it and where we clashed and why I ended up doing what I did. I appreciate y'all. Take it easy. Peace.